Hello and most welcome to 786. We're presently recording here at the local library at the village of Vårgårda. My voice is a bit bad today, and I hope that this will be audible. Let's see here. I will speak today in 786 about something I call exactness and crudeness. This is a common trait among Western thinking, and it's the lack of precision when we do things. It struck me when I read this book about jokes, misspellings in newspapers and in books. Something that has become incredibly common the last 2 decades. We are no longer correcting what journalists and authors are writing, and neither are they being very careful about how they write things. This lack of exactness, this lack of precision, this negligence when it comes to actually perform something to the detail, I think this is a little bit more than just sloppiness. I think this is actually a good hint to what the West has always been doing, and that's the neglect of the action, the procedure. Even though in the example I mentioned is the end product that is perceivable, but the end product can sometimes be a good pointer to a badly executed movement, but sometimes it cannot be seen because movement cannot always be detected. But I still think we have a lack of understanding that it is in the movement that all the knowledge is. One of those reasons is, of course, what we found out in the study of artificial intelligence, very well experimented with by Robert Pfeiffer, the Swiss engineer that constructed machines that learn from movement and carries all the information in their movement, not in representation. This, and the second reason is we don't have enough storage in our brains or any computer in the world to take in all the different bits of information that can only be taken in by movement itself. Movement is fractal and can contain an infinite number of bits if it's stored in bits. Actually, there is something called fractal quantization, and then it's not only bits, it's in between bits, the so-called qubit. A fractal movement can thereby contain all the information in the universe many times around. So in a single movement, everything is stored. Robert Pfeiffer himself says that it's not likely that any knowledge can be permanently stored in some storage. It is very hard to see the reason for that. Now, this is pointing to something that is quite interesting, and this, I think, stems all the way back to the embodiment of knowledge in Western tradition, something that was going on until more or less the 7th or the 6th century before Christ, and that it was developing different methods to store knowledge, to progress knowledge, and they were in the sense of movement. the movement of the pen to the parchment or papyrus, or the movement in learning something. Almost at the same time, a similar movement was developed in what is today Iran or Persia. These things have been going on in the East almost for 2,000-3,000 years already by the time we started in the West to do this. The interesting thing is this was already halted before it had the chance to develop. Our tradition turned into a quite different way, and we stopped to see knowledge as movement and start looking for something stable, rigid, static for knowledge. And I would say that's the beginning of the solidification of knowledge in Western tradition. A knowledge that is not movable, and a world that is unmovable, static, permanent, forever. Somewhere in this radical change, we stopped to perceive knowledge as knowledge. Instead, we had an icon for knowledge, a representation. One could even call that an idol for knowledge, instead of having knowledge that actually was perceived as something mildly to very negative. We have the idol of knowledge, the surface of knowledge. And I would say this idol later turned into the world of ideas, the death of knowledge, the death of movement, where everything is completely static. It has come to rest. It has died, the death of knowledge inside the cave. But that's a development that takes a couple of centuries. Most interesting is in the very beginning, why it stopped. And I think the change in language is one of the reasons as well as proofs of this really different tendency, unique to our development of knowledge. We stopped using knowledge terms. Verbs are the only terms that can carry knowledge because they have movement in themselves. And then we have the development instead of objects. Objects are ex posteriori movements, but the knowledge is already gone, and the only thing you see is the so-called end product. What do I mean by that? Well, let me illustrate this in the following mode. During all this time I have been having lectures about Roman history, I often mention especially the cement of the Romans were fantastic, and it got even more stable after exposure to salt water. Two properties that are incredibly valuable as properties of cement, but this knowledge was gone when the Roman Empire disappeared in the late 4th century, 467 I remember. And when I mention this, you don't know how the Roman cement is made. I had so many people, at least 50 people, ask me, why don't they reproduce it? Why don't they take the cement they found and sort of analyze it and then realize how it was made? And I think they are speaking from their heart when they say that. They actually believe that. The only one who didn't agree with that was a chemical engineer, he knows directly that is impossible. You need to know how it's done. But the more interesting thing is, of course, why these people all thought if you have the end product, you would know how it's done. That's not true. It cannot be true. In some cases, it could be approximately true. But the reason being that the movement carry a lot more information that is not showing up in the end product because we don't know where to look. There are an infinite wealth of possibilities in looking at the end product, and you cannot go from the end product to the method it was made of. But I would say this grave misunderstanding about movement and doings that we have in the West that was shown by these people is something caused by the Western development of a stable knowledge or a stable view of the world. The world not made actively by a perceiving agent like me, or as in the example I gave 5-6 lectures ago about the amoeba, where perception, action, eating, doing is all the same. And I say it must be that way with human beings as well. So we need to sort of be happy with something derived, something second hand, and that's the stable end product. That's the rigid remnants of what was knowledge and what is the only knowledge. And in the West, we start looking at the shadows. Isn't that a good description? We looked at the shadow of what was the doings, and that's the only thing we can perceive. And I would say in this aspect, the cave metaphor is quite good. It's exactly what happens, but not in actual time. We always look at something after it's done. Remember the ideas. What are the ideas really? Well, there are things that are already constructed, where the movement has ceased, where you see a table, a trapeza, where you see a chair, where you see a cow. Everything is already finished. You don't see how the cow moves. You don't see how the chair, how the vase, how the idea was developed. You only see the end product, and that is just a shadow. It's not enough. And it constitutes some arbitrary constellation that will not tell you about the movement. It will hint to the movement, but it cannot tell you all of the movement. There is a lack in knowledge, and this perceived lack, because it was perceived by the Greek thinkers felt that they had no longer knowledge. This perceived lack led to going even further from the movement, making the stable even more stable, and moving further and further away from what is real. This is the center of action. This doesn't act. To be transcendent is to be rigid, to be static, non-movable, frozen, I would say. Yeah, the freezing effect, which is also a sort of doing, but the freezing effect, the tension effect, that is the rigidity. That is a Western thinking mode. And this understanding came late in the Western civilization. It came with quantum mechanics, and it came, what I'm going to mention a bit more here, artificial intelligence, where we finally realize that the founding idea had some problems to it. And that seemed to be that stability might not be the right way to go about. It could lead that you don't really have access to what happened. Let me give you an example here. Think about the different movement traditions you can find further east. One of those things are movement. Movement in a way that's been ceremonialized, made into something reputable, and also made into something that can be seen and imitated. And that very thing is exactness in the imitation. That is learning. Let me give you an example here. We have something called Chano Yu, and this is something marvelous. It's also called the ceremony of tea. In this one, as a Westerner, we only perceive, so to speak, the end product. What is it when you look at it, not participating, or after it's finished? This is something you can look at. This is something you can name. This is something you can define. You are the observer, and you sort of observe something. And this other thing is stable, unmovable, and it's localized. But in the Chano Yu, it's the very movement that is important. And it is you as participating in the movement that counts, not from how it looks from the outside when it's finished or when it's about to be finished. And isn't it interesting, none of the ideas in the description of the cave myth is a movement. They are all static, dead things, non-moving, non-developing, dead things. There is a certain deadness to the cave, and you can almost feel your empty voice echoing in the cave, reaching out to nowhere. Nothing happened, no understanding. In the end, you have only these two blank eyes in a face that lacks features and movements, that deadened feeling of not understanding everything and just looking at things. I actually feel about Plato and Socrates and Aristotle. Those are the kids who were not let into the game when they were little. They had to look at the game, not performing in it, not developing. I think this is one of those of being a philosopher, that you are not developing. How terrible is not that? This complete stableness, this rigidity, it's terrible. It's defeatness. It's the end for carrying on. And also like the bonsai tradition. Everybody in the West thinks the bonsai, the tree that is kept in a dwarf state, that it's the end product that's interesting, how it looks when it's finished, not the several years it takes to make, not in the beauty of the person who cuts the tree, and in the actual process. If we were to understand process, it would always be something derived from rigidity. Because in our thinking, rigidity, staleness is always the prioritized thing in this dichotomy, whereas movement is derived from stable things. And this is exactly how it is in Newtonian physics. Everything is there derived from stability. A node point of reference is stability, assumed to be necessary for any understanding of the world, and the rest of the philosophers do exactly the same thing. They all look for stability to explain movement. And that always leads to disaster, like Zenon's paradox. Because if you ignore the most important thing, the movement of the turtle and the hare, and you say the movement is coming from the stability of the world and the non-movability of time and space, you cannot explain neither the hare nor the tortoise. Your fixation has led you astray and led to non-solution. And whereas you would think this should be a good reason not to go into that way anymore, it's just the opposite that happens. You get further and further into the rigidity, the stability, the fixation, until knowledge dissipates through your fingers because you only have second-hand information. You are sitting there with your stale second-hand derived things and try to extract some sort of knowledge out of them by cooking, boiling, making them even more voorhanden and more voorhanden, distancing yourself, trying to tense the whole of your body, try to tense your gaze, your balance, and in that you lose everything of knowledge. It is in the movement, and it always has been. And by going back to the movement, we can also see how that solves problems within logic we thought to be unsolvable, and that actually turn up to be quite easily solvable, easier than you can ever imagine. But I think I leave that to 787. I say thank you very much, and sorry about my voice. Have a good afternoon.